The history of Venice cannot be described without talking about its history of art, its twisting waterways, the sudden bursts of reflected light, and that special Venetian marriage of land and water. Venice in the 16th century was an age of splendor, although signs of its decadence were already becoming evident. It was thanks to the ruling aristocracy, who were Venetians themselves, and to the age-old political and commercial policies of the state, that the churches and palazzi are still full of art treasures. Despite its fierce religious independence, the Lutheran Reformation and Counter-Reformation had made themselves felt even in the Venetian Republic. This was a territory where the Pope, leaving spiritual rule aside, was considered merely to be a ruler of another foreign state. And it was the brushwork of Tintoretto that faithfully recorded the dramatic changes that Venice was going through in that era. Tintoretto spent all his life in Venice, but there is a strange ambivalence between his hectic yet sedentary life and his painting. There is a quality of extraordinary restlessness in it that seems to have affected all Venetian Renaissance painting. From the death registers, it appears that Jacopo Robusti Tintoretto was born in 1519 in the working-class quarters of the parish of San Marziale, and that he died on the 31st of March 1594 after a fortnight's fever. Tintoretto's name derives from his father's trade. He was a tintore, that is, a dyer of silk. Silk dyeing was a common Tuscan trade, and it is thought that Tintoretto's family may have originated from Lucca, which would explain why his paintings were displayed in the nearby ancient Scuola dei Lucchesi. Unfortunately, all that remains of this building is an antique well and a holy image of the face of Christ the Redeemer. So Tintoretto grew up among color, which like a living thing permeates and transforms the aspect of every object it meets. His precocious talent for painting soon became manifest. So as a result, according to his biographer Carlo Ridolfi, Tintoretto was sent to studying painting under the great artist Titian, who you can see here in a self-portrait. However, Titian was so envious of the young boy's talent that he threw him out of his shop shortly afterwards. Despite this, Tintoretto never ceased to admire the great master painter, so much so that he had inscribed over the entrance to his workshop the slogan, "Michelangelo's hand with Titian's color." By 1539, according to one witness of his times, Tintoretto had already been working for nigh on 10 years as a master painter, or Mistro de Pentor, in his own workshop in Campo San Cassan. Tintoretto's early works very much reflect his models. These included Bonifacio de Pitati and his graceful narrative style, Pordenone and his austere, full-bodied, anti-Titianesque figures. Shortly after this, the influence of Andrea Schiavone also transpires in his work. Tintoretto worked very closely with him in the early years. The Venetian circle in which Tintoretto found himself at the beginning was basically made up of painters working in the Mannerist style. Mannerism was introduced to Venice by artists coming from Florence and even from Rome after the sack of the city in 1527. Sebastiano del Piombo and Il Sansovino were two such Roman artists. There was no doubt that Tintoretto was anxious to study Renaissance works of art, and he had sent at great expense engravings of major contemporary masterpieces by artists such as Raphael and Michelangelo. He even commissioned Daniele da Volterra to produce casts of the statues on the Medicean tombs. Although by the time they arrived in 1557, Tintoretto had little left to learn from them. It was perhaps this voracious appetite for anything that implied novelty, driven by the fact that he was self-taught, that made Tintoretto a main representative of Venetian Mannerism. In 1540, Tintoretto painted, probably together with Schiavone, the compartments of a ceiling in the Palazzo dei Pisani in Paterniano, with 14 scenes of mythological tales inspired by Ovid's Metamorphoses. These paintings are now conserved in the Estensi Museum in Modena. The plastic aspect of the 14 infillings was necessitated by the fact that they would have only been viewed from floor level. They are a perfect example of how swift and easy Tintoretto's style had already become. The flowing progression of each scene highlights with shafts of light only the central theme of each tale. In order to be able to carry out a pictorial scheme of this nature, Tintoretto had developed a special rapid brushwork technique. Boschini called this technique praticon de man, whilst Aretino, far more critically, remarked that Tintoretto took less time to paint his figures than to think about what he was painting. However, the very modernity of Tintoretto's art derives from this rapid, rhythmic, almost whirlwind style that was very much appreciated by later Romantic artists such as Delacroix. Solomon and Sheba is one of a set of 6 biblical paintings that probably served to decorate a set of wedding chests. These paintings were once attributed to Schiavone, but are now thought to be by Tintoretto himself. At present, they are kept in Vienna. In his busy workshop, Tintoretto's artistic personality took shape, and his paintings began to appear throughout Venice. His first Last Supper, painted in 1547, is to be found in the ancient church of San Marcuola. The foreshortening with no background places the table of the Last Supper on a steeply inclined floor flanked by 2 allegorical figures of faith and charity. The figures of the apostles are enveloped in the colors of their clothing, as if in a flame which culminates with their animated and bold gesticulations. The light from their halos enhances their profiles like a flash of lightning. The reverberation caused by the Reformation of the Catholic Church had lost much of its effect by the time it had reached Venice. It did, however, become reflected in religious architecture in its triumphal aspects. During the early Renaissance, Venetian architects such as Lombardo and Codusi had already been attempting to bring Venice into line with the rules of classical architecture that new humanistic studies had taught them. The various religious congregations of Venice concentrated on their moral obligations by setting up numerous religious schools in order to conduct works of charity and to offer professional training to the sons of the common people. In 1548, Tintoretto painted the Miracle of the Slave for the wealthy Scuola di San Marco. Saint Mark appears in the picture in a flash of blinding light, with his cloak flying behind him. Below lies the freed naked slave, with his executioner turned towards the ruler in order to show him the instruments of torture that have been shattered by St. Mark's blow. The crowd is struck dumb and slightly fearful. Many portraits are recognizable in the crowd scene. Some of them are dressed in Moorish clothing, and you can almost hear the tumult and the muttering of the people as they gather in a semicircle around the slave in such a way that the viewer is drawn directly into the action. In 1550, Tintoretto painted a set of canvases with the story of the creation for another school called the Scuola della Trinità. Today, these canvases are kept in the Accademia in Venice. In the creation of the animals, God Eternal flies silently between earth, sea, and sky. With one single serene commanding gesture, he brings up out of nothing the beasts of the earth, the fish of the water, and the birds of the sky. In the original Sin, the artist narrates that tragic sweet moment of an irresistible Eve's offer of terrible temptation. The two naked bodies of Adam and Eve are in full light. They are an integral part of nature, which is both passionate and as violent as the sin itself. Behind Adam and Eve, you can see in the distance, as though in a dream, the final fatal scene when Adam and Eve are chased out of the Garden of Eden forever.
In Cain and Abel, humanity is all shorn of grace. Abel is lighter than his assassin brother, but the decapitated head of a fawn underlines the act of blood. The background is livid and enraged, a story without enticement.
In 1553, Veronese came to Venice to work on the Ducal Palace. Veronese's clear and very classical artistic style was a source of inspiration for Tintoretto. Although Tintoretto did not seek to be eclectic, his continual search for new ideas to feed his almost ungovernable creative energy meant that he inevitably initiated models created by other artists. Saint Ursula's Journey, which can be seen in the church of San Lazzaro dei Mendicanti, is an exemplification of this. Veronese's style is echoed throughout the almost fantastical depiction of the subject matter. Again, in the next painting entitled Susanna and the Elders, there is a quiet hint of Veronese. And although his biographers have described Tintoretto as a joyless man, he nonetheless was sensitive to the worldly and festive characteristics of Venice. In his paintings, he would draw on both biblical and mythological lore to inspire him to the creation of sensuous female nudes, such as Susanna. Susanna has an opalescence that reflects the whiteness of the cloth with which she is drying herself, the crystalline shine of the silver flask, the colors of her jewels and her looking-glass, and the roses in the hedge before her. All the objects that surround Susanna merely serve to enhance her nakedness, which appears to absorb the natural luminosity of the garden. In the early 1550s, Tintoretto produced a presentation of the Virgin, a large painting for the shutters of the organ in the church of Santa Maria dell'Orto. This work really enabled Tintoretto to compare his stature as an artist against that of Titian. The picture is divided into two by a clever play of chiaroscuro. The left-hand side of the painting is crowded with activity, while the right remains almost empty, showing only maternal figures in semi-obscurity. The mother, who is pointing out Maria to her young daughter, serves to enliven the scene, and her pointing arm draws the eye to the tiny figure of the Virgin, silhouetted against a cloudy sky. The church of Santa Maria del Giglio was reconstructed in exaggerated Baroque style, halfway through the 17th century, as sort of late homage to the Counter-Reformation. In 1557, Tintoretto painted the four evangelists onto the doors of the organ there. The evangelists are locked in an intense study of the scriptures. Their extraordinarily energetic and heroic depiction are redolent of the works of Michelangelo. As well as carrying out commissions for various churches and schools in Venice, Tintoretto also worked in the private houses of the Venetian nobility. Ridolfi, Tintoretto's biographer, remembers seeing the painting of St. George killing the dragon, which now hangs in the National Gallery in London, in the house of the senator, Pietro Correr. The painting is clear and fresh, with a certain mystical quality. The princess flees in her terror, encouraging the viewer to follow her with his eyes, while St. George, with one impetuous leap of his horse, pierces the dragon through with his weapon. The tragic pathos of the scene is embodied by the dead soldier lying between the two like a crucifix. Above, the sky is filled with scudding clouds set into motion by the shining vortex of light emanating from God. In a second painting on the same theme, the scene is more grotesque. The princess rides on the dragon, now reduced to a mere plaything, past an astonished St. George and St. Louis. It is a strange depiction of humanity, where religious ritual combines with courtly chivalry. Although Tintoretto received increasing demands from the Venetian nobility to execute private commissions, the church remained his main patron. 14 years after he had completed the Miracle of the Slave, Tintoretto was asked by the Scuola di San Marco to produce 2 other paintings to accompany his earlier cycle of the life of the saint in the rooms on the upper story. One work, The Abduction of the Body of St. Mark, is now on display in the Accademia in Venice. The perspective is dizzying. The action of the picture takes place in the center of an imaginary square. Across the stage move tenuous Eastern-looking figures in flight. The only tangible sense of reality is created by the group of tomb robbers as they make off with the body of the saint.
At Milan is conserved the Ritrovamento del Corpo di San Marco. The saint himself indicates to the Venetians his own corpse, which is being lowered into the tomb, and simultaneously appears very white between him and the commissioner in school clothes. Light and shadow rival each other for the figures, and in different forms, the elements of the eternal decoration gather in the dramatic commotion of the scene. Venice, notwithstanding that it was marginalized from the thickening of relationships between Europe and the New World, discovered by Columbus at the end of the preceding century, continued to be rich. Queen of maritime traffic with the Orient, the lagoon city was more exposed, among other things, to the plague, the terrifying voyage companion of mankind's history. The plague was above all communicated by sea. To exorcise this curse, some Venetians departed from Montpellier, where the corpse of San Rocco, protector against plagues, was situated. They adventurously stole it and parted for Venice, and around the sainted relics was founded a confraternity named after the saint, with church and school. In 1564, to embellish the school, a competition between the artists in the city was announced, which consisted of the creation of an arch with the image of the saint. 3 months were given to present the model. Tintoretto, as Vasari recounts, completed in those few months the finished painting and had it mounted. In addition, he declared that he didn't want paying for this work of devotion. This was enough for the majority of councillors to decide to give him the work. Thus, Tintoretto made the school, in over 20 years of work, one of the most extraordinary containers of 16th century art.
The first great piece in the long series to be carried out was a great crucifixion. It is a careful work of almost architectonic composition, and it took up the entire wall of one room. In the center, the Roman army, standing for humanity, mill around the cross-bearing crucified Savior. The perspective of the painting is broken up into a myriad of pieces according to the light and the groups of figures on the scene. The perspective both separates and unites, dividing characters up according to the parts they have to play in the tale. The whole painting is fused with the most complex possible activity of light, drawing one's gaze first here and then there. A light veil of shadow seems to cast itself over the whole scene of activity, growing darker towards the ominous and threatening sky in the background. The next picture is a nativity. The intense eye for detail that this pastoral nativity displays betrays the influence on Tintoretto of the religious paintings of Jacopo Bassano, with his rustic, rural settings. The Nativity is divided into two levels. In the top half, the Holy Family is bathed in a divine light, which filters through the roof above their heads. Below, two shepherds hand up to the Holy Family the gifts that the common folk have brought to give to the baby Jesus. The third painting is a Last Supper.
The evangelic element is connected in a series of immeasurable rooms. In close-up, two large figures, maybe beggars, which allude to the compassionate activity of the schools, and the dog, which recalls the legend of San Rocco, pilgrim in Italy, who met the evil of those sick with plague and cured them, and went to live in a wood near Piacenza, where he was fed by a dog, which every day robbed a cake for him. The apostles, their faces defined as in portraits, seem to be animatedly in discussion. Christ is far off at the other end of the table with Peter, his face radiant with light.
While Tintoretto was working in the squalor of St. Roch, he was also involved in a number of other artistic projects in the city. Venice was not only crumbling at its architectural foundations, but also at its moral base. Tintoretto was almost committing bigotry when he undertook immorally flagrant commissions to paint mythological scenes such as Venus and Vulcan. In the picture, a mirror shows us a spying husband, rendered suspicious by the languid attitude of his bride. Love pretends to be asleep, while the lover, Mars, is clumsily hidden under a piece of furniture, only to be betrayed by the barking of the little lapdog. It is a very common scene of adultery, rendered light-hearted by touches of irony. In Tintoretto's religious repertoire, the theme of the Last Supper is recurrent. Perhaps this was due to the variety of people and human sentiments that the scene involves, and because he meant he had chance to paint everyday scenes from ordinary life. In 1570, Tintoretto painted a Last Supper for the Church of San Polo. The drama of the scene is created by the figure at Christ's feet. The geometric perspective is very classical, but this dissolves into a series of fluid lines charged with emotion. It is the sort of painting that needs careful study and repeated viewing to understand the passionate restlessness of the event unfurling before one's eyes. In May 1574, the Confraternity of St. Roch requested Tintoretto to paint the ceiling of the main room on the upper story. The following year saw him begin an accretion of a major work of art, known as the Brazen Serpent. Between 1583 and 1587, Tintoretto took up the decoration again of the squalor and managed to complete the rooms on the ground floor. In the main room, Tintoretto painted a flight in Egypt, which is exceptional in that the scenes are almost entirely dominated by the landscape setting. A weary Joseph and Mary seated on the donkey, and cradling the Holy Infant in her arms, form a little group on their own. On the right-hand side of the picture, one can see through the branches of the tree the misty river winding through cultivated fields, which symbolize the ordered lives of the country folk, waiting patiently for the coming of Christ. In the same room, two narrow pendant vertical panels depict a Mary of Egypt in the wilderness and a Magdalene. In the first picture, Mary of Egypt raises her eyes from her reading in a reflective gaze. We see the night through her eyes. It has become a pale suffusion of light. Mary Magdalene in the second picture is instead very intent on her reading, so much so that she seems to have become almost absorbed by the wood around her. Tintoretto's brushwork here is more and more fluid and sparing in color. There is a shimmering luminosity which permeates the whole painting. In many of the paintings, the characters have finely drawn features and faces. Tintoretto was used to painting portraits for people right from the early years of his career. In the beginning, it is easy to note the strong influence of Titian, but later Tintoretto became a very innovative and talented portrait artist in his own right. His portraits of the noblemen of Venice of his time are harshly realistic. The toils of time and life are evident on their faces. There is no artistic invention or rhetoric, for those were the people whose destiny it was to lead population and the city along the weary path of life. The sitter's secrets are laid bare in front of the artist before him. The solitude of the great, the bitterness of life are ingrained on their features. It seems as though while Tintoretto painted these great men, the story of their lives was passing before their eyes. Glancing from one portrait to another, you can see the lost illusions of youth, the awareness of all the errors made, and the opportunities missed. Nonetheless, there is a trace of pride and a certain sense of consolation. The men in the portraits have their names written down in history, for they have been instrumental in the development and growth of a great and powerful republic. In 1558, Veronese died, and so Tintoretto took over the decoration of the ducal palace. For the great council chambers of the palace, he painted a vast paradise full of intricate and difficult complex forms. The work itself, which was somewhat criticized, was actually painted in sections in vast rooms in the Scuola della Misericordia. These sections were then carefully sewn together by Tintoretto's son, Domenico, and positioned on the wall of the council chambers, where the finishing touches were added. Shortly after this, Tintoretto was called upon once again to produce a Last Supper for the church of San Giorgio in Isola. This was to be the last great masterpiece of his hectic life. In the painting, Christ, seated at a long table, names the apostles. Two sources of light define the scene. There is the light from the camp above, suspended from the sky, and a spiritual light, which emanates from the figure of Christ. Even the angels are merely tenuous figures of light, whilst the other characters, the apostles, the servants, and the beggars, are much heavier and realistic. They represent the everyday side of humanity that are often seen in Tintoretto's representations of holy scenes. Ironically, in the final year of his life, Tintoretto painted a deposition in the chapel dedicated to the dead. The light in the painting is pale and barely illuminates the bleeding figure of Christ at the focal point of the scene. In the distance, Mary, mother of Jesus, has collapsed with grief, and behind her winds the inexorable journey to Calvary. One gets the impression that Tintoretto painted this picture for himself. Tintoretto devoted the whole of his artistic energy to his Christian subject matter. His inspiration is both intense in the purity of his spiritual ideal and sensuous in its profanity. His life seems to be a dramatic series of light, shadow, and color, and of startling visions. But although Tintoretto spent the whole of his life in Venice, his real surroundings never once appear in any of his paintings.